Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Pathology. My name is Megan Bridge. I am a dancer, choreographer, and scholar, and I am the co-director of Fidget, a Philadelphia-based experimental arts organization. We are so glad to welcome you here this evening, and tonight we are very proud to present Pronounced 2, the work of duo Sarah Bouchara and Maya Miro Johnson, who you'll meet briefly at intermission this evening, and then again in the talkback after the show. Pronounced 2 creates original performance art, composed theater, text pieces, sound art, interpretive dance, and amateur films. Although I will tell you, after seeing last week's tech rehearsal, amateur is not the word that I would use to describe the works that you are about to see. Sarah and Maya are both students at the Curtis Institute here in Philadelphia. Tonight's program will unfold in 3 parts. Part 1 includes 10 different works. 7 of these are original works by Pronounced 2, and the other 3 are historical works by Fluxus artists. For those of you not up on your postmodern art history, I'm sure we'll talk more about Fluxus, which is probably my own personal favorite art movement of the 20th century, at the Q&A after the show. So definitely make sure you stick around for that. The Fluxus pieces are interspersed with the Pronounced 2 pieces in a way that interestingly highlights how Maya and Sarah are riffing on historical narratives and framing these with a fresh new perspective. You can see details on the program order at the digital program, which is about to be shared in the chat right now by my wonderful administrative assistant, Catherine DeSimone. There it is. There are also titles embedded within the video, so in between each of the works, so you can keep track of where we are throughout the evening. And part 1 is going to run about 80 minutes tonight. Then between parts 1 and 2, we will have a 10-minute intermission. So you can get away from the screen, stretch your legs, maybe refresh your beverage if you'd like. And then part 2 is only a short 8 minutes long and includes this evening's world premiere, Pronounced 2's Romanian folk dances 1, 2, and 3. Part 2 will be followed immediately by our Q&A with the artists. And I'm really looking forward to talking about these artworks. So please, again, make sure you do stick around for our Q&A. Just a couple of announcements before we get started this evening. We have several other events coming up later this spring for Fidget, including some Fidget Forum series, another performance in March. So you can find out more about all of this stuff at our website, thefidget.org, on our email list, or on social media. And if you'd like more info on what Pronounced 2 has coming up, you can visit them at their website, pronounced2.com. I want to thank all of you once again for being with us tonight and for purchasing tickets. And to some of you who donated towards the event, also thank you very much if you donated in addition to your ticket purchase. Your contributions are sustaining for us. So if you are able, please consider making an additional donation towards the show this evening. Your support goes directly to the artists and staff who are working on this show, and all of our Fidget staff are also working artists, so you know that your support is going to a good cause. The link to donate directly to Pathology is being shared. Yeah, Catherine already shared that in the chat as well. Thank you. I'd like to give a special thank you, speaking of Catherine, to Catherine DeSimone, our administrative assistant, who is helping things run smoothly behind the scenes and who did most of the administrative preparation to bring this event to you. I'd also like to thank Thomas Pattison, who is on our board of directors and programming committee and who introduced us to Sarah and Maya's work. And of course, to my partner, Peter Price, who is also the co-director of Fidget. Thank you, all of you guys. And thank you to the artists, of course. We are almost ready to get started. I'll just leave you with a few last words. I hijacked these from Maya's bio earlier today, and I think that her rich description of her own practice brings attention to some of the foremost qualities of Pronounced 2's work. According to Maya, her work focuses on manipulating the duality of the familiar and the strange, affirming the intellectual and aesthetic value of the proletariat by recontextualizing the quotidian, exorcising hereditary ghosts, and invoking the universe. Here we go, Pronounced 2.
According to the whole that I've seen, but I beat him easily in the IFL. I beat him easily. I think he felt it too. No, I'm not going to waste my time on a virtual debate. That's not what debating is all about. You sit behind a computer and you think it's ridiculous, and then they cut you off whenever they want. And then they try to protect Biden. Everybody is. Biden was raising his very thin hand and he was fracking, and now all of a sudden he's not fracking. They're lying to everybody. They're lying about so many different things. Yes, well, first of all, I think I'm better. I went to a point where I'd love to do a rally tonight. I wanted to do one last night. You know, no matter how good the security, you're not going to protect yourself from this thing with just your standard anything unless you just literally don't come out. No, I don't think I'm contagious, but we still have to wait. I don't think I'm contagious at all. This thing, you know, it's just particles of dust. It's tiny stuff. And remember this, when you catch it, you get better, and then you're immune. You know, as soon as everything goes away from you, you're immune. I'm glad because I'm the leader and I can't be like Biden, where I hang out in a basement every day. Sure, if I wanted to hang out in a basement, I wouldn't catch it, but I meet a lot of people and I have to. They were trying to get things and we were trying to get things, and it wasn't going anywhere. I shut it down. I don't want to play games. Perhaps a couple of pounds we could lose here and there, but you know, because a lot of people in that category. Now what happens if you get better? That's what happens, you get better. They want to hug me and they want to kiss me, and they do, and frankly I'm not telling them to back up. I'm not doing it, but I did say it's obviously dangerous. It's a dangerous thing, I guess, if you go by the COVID thing. I'm back because I'm a perfect physical specimen and I'm extremely young, and so I'm lucky in that way. I think I would have done it fine without drugs, and you know you don't really need drugs. I figured that probably at some point I'd catch it and I'll get better. That's what happened. I've caught it. I could have been out of the hospital in one day. Sometimes I'd be within groups of, for instance, Gold Star families. I met with Gold Star families. I didn't want to cancel it, but they all came in and they all talked about their son and daughter and father. I feel perfect now, Maria, otherwise I wouldn't be able to speak to you. They were trying to get things and we were trying to get things, and it wasn't going anywhere. I shut it down. I don't want to play games. Unless Bill Barr indicts these people for crimes, the greatest political crime in the history of our country, then we're going to get little satisfaction unless I win, and we'll just have to go because I won't forget it. But it's still not that easy. You have a deep state, you have a group of people that don't want to have documents shown, which tells you bad thing, you know, but they have to give them ultimately, and we're getting them, you know. Well, I don't want to say that yet. He's been disappointing. He talks about, you know, even the voting thing, that he doesn't see the voting ballots as a problem. If you were running for office and if you see thousands and thousands of ballots being thrown into rivers and they have your name on it, in some cases, in other words, we had military ballots where people voted for me. The military's going to vote for me because I rebuilt the military. Actually, it was Joe Biden that called the military a bunch of dirty bastards, and he said it on tape. He called them a bunch of dirty bastards, and he said it on tape. We're in all these different sites fighting in countries that nobody ever heard of, and it hurts us because where are your military? Look, I sit next to Joe, and I look at Joe just not lasting 2 months as president. Okay, that's my opinion. He's not going to be lasting 2 months. Pennsylvania will never go for him because Pennsylvania has 1 million jobs that are fracking. And I saved the chicken tax on the truck with South Korea. They were going to wipe out a chicken tax. I went to the farmers. I said, look, we got to play a game with these people, but I'm going to put tariffs on you. Nobody even hear of tariffs. We have a lousy phone here. I've never seen such liars as this. They're worse than wicked hair-losers in other ways. If people delete emails in a regular court case, delete 33,000 emails and nothing happens to her. Our justice system, nothing happens to her with all of the pages of stuff, thousands of pages that we have. On them, nothing happens to them, nothing happens. Frankly, the Bush people, some of these losers that used to work for Bush, they're worse than the Obama people. But looking, they're in the State Department, but Mike Pompeo is unable to get them out, which is very sad. Actually, I'm not happy about him for that reason. And you know, to be honest, Bill Barr is going to go down either as the greatest attorney general in the history of the country, or he's going to go down as a very sad situation. Be honest with you, he's got all the information he needs. No, I'll be tested pretty soon, but I'm essentially very clean. They say it's over periods of 6-7 days, and it was an amazing thing happened to me. I've got to be a leader. I can't. Winston Churchill didn't sit in his basement for 6 months. And I think at some point, it's a tiny, you can get to a tiny little microscopic piece of dust, and it gets into your nose or your mouth or your eye, frankly, or something else. Or you touch something, so I understand, and then you get better. It's not a heavy steroid. But why isn't Hillary Clinton being indicted for terminating 33,000 emails that she got from Congress? Congress made a request to see them. Everybody else I know gets indicted when they don't do that. We have tremendous Black community support, men and women, by the way, because I've done more for the Black community than any president except Abraham Lincoln, and it's true. He's not mentally capable of being president, that everybody knows that. And this monster that was on stage with Mike Pence, who destroyed her last night, by the way, but this monster, she says no, there won't be fracking. I make him actually play for the whole state, I did well there before. I don't believe the polls because we've never had as much support. They have a vote thing. They have 5,000 votes. They have thousands of trucks all over the country. This country will go to hell. Your taxes will double and triple and quadruple. Your stock markets will crash. We'll have a depression, the likes of which we've never seen before.
Male supremacy is the fundamental source of the axiom of obliteration that has come to dominate and impose power structures in human culture. Patriarchy is thus the fundamental evil of all society from which racism, homophobia, classism, and xenophobia spring. The misogynist root of the concept that a person is not only fundamentally inferior, but specifically designed to be inferior was the Pandora's box of human hatreds, fueled by the kindling of religion, the sole purpose of which was to cement and explain male-female power dynamics and codices using the language of authority and absorption to exert external control as a way of relieving the guilt of the masculine incapacity for self-control. The ancient and eternal cruelty that a woman should be a body first, an empty vessel, is the first step in the eventual accession of black bodies on the auction block or contemporaneously the football field, and thus the attenuation of the individual into the uncontrollably physical, the first and last prison to which the feminine is consigned. Thus the belief in the fall of Eve and the curse of Ham are one and the same. Gertrude Stein remarked in the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas that there are three kinds of women: femme d'arrotie, femme d'intérieur, femme intrigante, essentially a repetition of the fundamentally imposed triad upon the female consciousness and unconscious that a woman can be only a maiden, a whore, or an earth mother, or some combination thereof. However, in making this remark, she clearly excludes herself from consideration as a female figure. The hypermasculinization of her traits makes her relationship with Alice, unorthodox as it may have been at the time, merely a reification of the subsumption or belonging of the intellect in the masculine. And the post-enlightenment focus and practices of domination and mastery, the native invasive species of the uneasing and unsettling power dynamic is insoluble by force or individual willpower alone, nor by the post-enlightenment and now postmodernist radical equality of mutual exploitation. Similarly, simple numerical parity is not enough if the social mirror still reflects a twisted image of woman as intrinsically threefold, no more and no less representation. As long as the tripartite paradigm remains, paradoxically deeply ingrains the subliminal message to every generation of women that they must always sell a part of themselves, or to reframe that there must always be a part of themselves which they must be willing to sell. If there is not that part, they are not female, but some bastardization of a man. It is reductionistic to say that all men subscribe to the above principles. It is not a generalization, however, to say that human society not only subscribes to, but is composed of these atomized concepts. All men and women at some point in their life will succumb to language that bites painlessly but fatally. The primary aspect of language is its virality, not a coincidence perhaps that virility would be its close cousin. As Laurie Anderson astutely remarks, paradise is exactly like where you are right now, only much, much better. This is the yoke of language. It keeps us in the expectation of martyrdom, the essence of a saint who has been deprived, and as a sinner who has been rewarded simultaneously. It preserves the need for self while destroying the self's capacity to be. In this, we find the inherent ulterior motive that denominates and distinguishes the subtle and overt trope of male-female relationships, both public and private, from the true side of another human being. Language is the unwanted touch of the soul. When a man or a woman acting within the invisible cultural confines of her self-loathing hypermasculinization can think of nothing else to say to a woman except that she is beautiful without her consent or invitation to be described as such, it is demonstrative of a fundamental lack of recognition of the masculine innate desire for ownership, the invasive desire to be pleased aesthetically and personally by another person's mere presence, as if they only exist to provide beauty, provoke eventually desire, and in the eye of another, create a response. This is store-bought romance, the pernicious and disquieting hallmark card which proves to the woman again and again that her highest achievement will always be desirability, the subjective art of preparing oneself to be sold, which so many women capitulate to in their capitalist fever dream of sexual liberation. Repulsion is the feeling inculcated in the fundamental essence of womanhood, a repulsion which can swing towards inhibition and repression equally, both of which being doubles of the self-loathing inherent in the female placement of the self in the body, which is perhaps naturally occurring, but also predominantly culturally enforced from birth. When the woman is repulsed by the man or the male behavior, she is fundamentally repulsed by her own inability to combat it and ability to incite it. When a woman takes on male behavior such as violence, domination, desire, ownership, and the gaze of consumption in an attempt to make herself equal by forcibly absorbing male behavior, she only deepens this self-disgust by making or taking the mask that frightens her so. But the hypermasculinization or vis-a-vis prostitution involved in the attainment of numerical representation is as much a tool of patriarchy as any wife beating or village stoning. It regurgitates those marionette-like properties back onto the woman and the girl, reifying their primal belief in the pantsuit feminist ideal forged itself by patriarchy, an affirmation of the supremacy of the Stockholm Syndrome-esque male aberration within the female mind. Until cultural standards of feminine power are eradicated, there will be no equality, even in the face of growing numerical parity. Women are as conducive to mistakes as men, but are in fact goaded into the maddening pursuit of perfection by a male-centric culture which pays a woman a full dollar for their legs, but 70 cents per their brains. This wet market of politics, culture, business, leadership, and entertainment is validated by the pockmarks of small victories that promote those molded by male expectations of power or submissiveness, and can only be counteracted by art.
The problem is that if we didn't know that, the piece would be very simple. It would be the sound of one shoe tapping, right? Because if that the piece is about the sound, and And we know that because if the piece weren't about the sound, it would be one shoe tapping, right? But then the complicating factor is that it's this like implicit satire of Holden Caulfield and the proliferation of like Zen koans to people who have absolutely no idea what a Zen koan is, but can do nothing but talk about the sound of one hand clapping. Like, I don't know, is the piece about the sound, is the piece about the title, or is it the piece about the shoe? Though I suppose he's also highlighting the fact that Zen and vaudeville kind of have the shared goal of taking the individual's perception out of time and place, or of like either augmenting reality or denying reality, or at least seeing, I don't know, just not necessarily even being in reality. Like it has to do with being, right? The implication with tapping, right? Because tapping can mean so many different things. It could be the sound of many taps in a row, tapping as a gerund, as like this active state of being, or it could be a single sound. It's just a tap, right? And then there's also the whole cultural baggage of tap dance, and tapping being considered like a very specialized and formalized activity, which itself has so many contradictions because it's fundamentally an African American art form. It came from plantations and slavery and like West African dances. But at the same time, then once vaudeville came around, you had like the, you know, the Italians and the Jews and kind of the European marginalized groups contributing their culture, and then suddenly 10 years later, like Fred Astaire and Ginger Roger are like rich white people dancing on an ocean liner. Like I don't know. That trajectory is also like implied in the piece. Like it's invoking all of these things while also almost invoking nothing. Like,
what does a singular tapping look like? Is it one performance? Is it a performance in which you can only hear one of the shoes?
if we were to have a whole dance troupe tapping, but muted all of their audio outputs except for one, and so that's literally sound of one shoe, you know, tapping, even though the visual aesthetic is the crowd and the noise and the chaos. And
It's a hyper individual exercise. If the piece is, if the performance and the consumption of the piece are meant to be inextricably merged, then what does it mean to do it for a concert? Then, I mean, based on what you're saying, does that mean that there should be a prompt that's given to? But I mean, even as an audience member, if you're aware that every other audience member gets the same prompt, then kind of the individual aspect is muted or even non-existent. The
individualism in everyone liking the same thing, or everyone thinking about the same idea, or the fact that like a lot of young people, right, fall prey to this idea of contemporaneousness being individuality when it's just another form of obedience. Like,
what's the perfect response of a Zen student to a question posed to him by the master? I don't know.
I think the point of koans is that they are kind of unanswerable, right? Like there's no answer. To be or not to be, like, that is the question, but there's no assumption or expectation of an answer. I mean,
for us, maybe we know this, as we're writing a piece, we consider things that are fundamentally impossible. It's not just the purity of concept is maybe not even the first priority. But I think for some of these Fluxus pieces, and maybe for this one in particular, it is purely about the concept, and the possibility of it being performed is totally irrelevant. But then I don't know what that means for us as performers.
I don't know. It's like, I agree with you, but at the same time, Friedman also has these pieces like directly adjacent to the Zen vaudeville in the workbook. I mean, I think they do span like 20 years or something like that, but they're still on the same page in some way, shape, or form, and like homage to Mahler or homage to Christo. And like maybe he's saying that Mahler and Christo, the kinds of works they did were impossible until someone did them, right? And now he's proposing something that does seem impossible now, but then at a certain point will cease being impossible. There's not a lot of free will involved. But on the other hand, then like it's a kind of either
It's as
or.
much
It's
as you
like
want.
either,
I mean, maybe it's part of the project of Fluxus is to, well, it's to just whatever destroy any conception we have about the institution of art, to democratize these performances, which mean that some of them should be about the act of thinking and can be or should be totally individual. There should never be a performance. There should never be a deadline. It could be that in 20 years you figure out how to perform this piece, and then only then have you completed the piece, and the performance lasts the whole 20 years. And in some of them, which are very simple, like make soup or make a salad or unwrap something.
Or theatrical, like Viking event, where
Yes,
I mean,
the point is
it's
that anybody
ridiculous,
can
but you
do them
can see it
now.
happening. You know, yeah.
No matter how outlandish they are, it's the virtuosity of the performer is more or less irrelevant. So maybe that gives us a clue as to how to interpret this. Maybe it shouldn't. It might be impossible, but it's not difficult. There's a difference between. It's not like impossible is like the apotheosis of difficulty. It just the two in fact aren't related.
Right, it's not a sliding scale, and they're almost completely separable qualifiers. I really like that. Yeah, that's a great idea. I still don't know what that means in terms of performing this piece, but it's something to keep in mind.
I'll openly betray my Western ignorance. I mean, part of maybe to me, I don't know. Part of Zen Buddhism is to reject or question the sort of power dialectic between intellectualism and conscious thought, and its opposite, which isn't intuition. It's not being a slave to the flesh. It's just that it's maybe some sort of light mysticism, that there are some answers that we can't know, and there are some answers that if we arrive,
they aren't answers nonetheless. Yeah.
Yeah, if we arrive at, yes, they exist, but we can't know them. If the koan, though, is a question asked of a student by a master, does the answer have to be something fundamentally interpersonal, and does that demand specificity? I don't know. Does the right answer depend on who the two people involved are?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the problem we're facing right now, because we don't have a stage, and a stage is generally a space which creates heightened awareness of, and that's why any action committed on a stage is heightened in some way, shape, or form. And so, but right now we're on Zoom. We don't have a stage, so it's like it's hard to stage an event where you need to be attuned in the way that a stage makes your senses attuned.
I think it's impossible.
Yeah.
Concept art is just a cheap bag of tricks.
Concept art is a cheap bag of tricks.
Concept art
A cheap
is
bag
just a cheap bag.
Concept art is a cheap bag of tricks.
It's just cheap. It's just a cheap bag of tricks.
Concept art is a cheap bag of tricks.
Concept art is a cheap bag of tricks.
Concept art. Just a cheap bag of tricks.
Cheap bag of tricks. Just a cheap bag of tricks. Concept art is a cheap bag of tricks. Cheap.
Cheap bag of tricks. Just a cheap old bag of tricks.
winter of our discontent made
Friends,
glorious summer.
Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar,
And all the clouds that lowered
not
upon
to
our
praise
house in the
him.
deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows
The evil men do
victorious.
lives after them. The good is often interred with
Our
their
bruised
bones
arms,
hung
so
up
let
for
it be
for
for
Caesar.
monuments.
Noble Brutus had
Not
large.
to
Caesar was
to
ambitious.
memory
If it were so,
A dreadful march
it was a grievous fault.
Delightful measures.
Grim visage
Grievously
grievously
smoothed
hath Caesar
eyes
answered it.
wrinkled front.
And now instead of mounting barbed steeds to fright the souls of fearful adversaries, seeking rest where Brutus is an honorable man, so are they all honorable
to take
men.
arms.
Do the lascivious
Against
mind
Caesar
to
of
speak
the
at
sea of
Caesar's
troubles,
funeral,
I
opposing
end them.
I did him not shaped for sportive tricks.
And I
He was my friend,
made to court an amorous
faithful, and just
I
to me that
No,
am. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is
loves majesty
honorable
to
man.
we
We
say
say
we
we end the heartache. Paladin,
He hath brought many
tales
tales
of this
flesh
fair
and
crow, cheated, who was
Consolation
represented by
and
dissembling
general
nature,
nature,
and Caesar seem ambitious, deformed. When that the poor have finished, Caesar hath wept
before my time
vision
into this
should be
prison
projected stuff. Yet
I
Brutus,
that so
says he was
lately
an
and
fashion is an honorable
death
man.
seems made common.
We have shuffled off this
mortal
You all
life.
did see that on the Lupercal I thrice presented
What?
him the kingly crown, which he did thrice
In this
refuse.
weak
Was
Pisces
this
and vexed that makes
ambition?
calamity
Yet
of
Brutus
so long
says he
life.
was ambitious, and sure Brutus is an honorable man. Just by my shadow in the sun,
Scores of
and
times
not
the
the
oppressor
oppressor
wrongs,
but
the
the
proud man
man's here I am to
continually
say what I
abused.
do know. You all did love him. The laws can lay the insolence of office and the spurnings. What caused the cold you unworthy grace. When he himself might his wages make, but with a bare bodkin thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason.
Inductions
Bear with me. Would Fardels bear? My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause
and
through a
dreams
weary life till it come back to me.
to set
But that
my
my
brother
brother
Clarence
Clarence and the
after.
king, and did they hate the one against the other?
And
If
if
King
King
Edward be as true and
just as I am several false and treacherous,
from whose born no
this
traveller
day should
returns,
Clarence
be closely mewed up about a prophecy.
puzzles
It
the
says
riddle.
that G of Edward's
It makes us
rather bear those ills
we have
and fly to the others.
You
we know not of.
This conscience does make cowards of us all. And thus, the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with a pale cast of thought. And enterprises of great pitch and resolution, with this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action.
Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury
And all the clouds
Caesar,
lowered upon our house in the deep bosom
not to
of the
praise
ocean
him.
buried.
Now are our brows bound with the
Victory
evil that men
glorious.
do lives after them. The good is often tarried with their
Our
bones.
bruised arms
So let
hung
it be.
For
With
monuments,
Caesar,
not
the noble Brutus had
Our
told
arms
you, Caesar was ambitious. If it were so, it
dreadful
was a
march
grievous
has
fault.
delightful measure.
And grievously
visaged
visaged
war
war
hath
hath Caesar as his suffer.
Slings
And now in your
Here
arrow
am
must
I.
cease to fright the souls of
Brave
his
soldiers
adversaries
seek
rest.
papers.
For Brutus is an honorable man, so are they all honorable men. Do the lascivious mind to speak against Caesar's funeral.
trouble, and by opposing
I did him not
and
shaped for sportive
to
tricks,
die,
nor made to court an amorous look. He was my friend,
to sleep
I,
no more.
faithful, that am
Proved
just
just,
out.
nice,
want
loved
Yet
majesty
majesty
struck before
says he was
walking
ambitious, and
and
Brutus is an honorable man. Partake and the
thousand
thousand tales
natural
of this
shock
fair
hath
brought
flesh
many
to
captives of feature
of
by
our
dissembling
own
friends. Did the
nature.
general coffers fill? Did this in Caesar seemed
Ambitious.
deformed,
To sleep.
unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world's
To
chaos.
sleep,
Perchance to dream, I,
There's
that's
the
so
rub.
lately and unfashionable that
For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal toil?
Why I, Caesar hath wept in this weak, piping time of peace, have
made
no
of
life.
sterner
There's
stuff.
the prospect makes calamity of so
Long life.
Just by my shadow in the sun,
There, the
and
witness,
scan
of
to see that on the
thorns.
lubricant I thrice the presented him a kingly crown, which he did
Proud
thrice
man.
refuse.
Concealed
Was this the paying mission? Yes,
Brutus loves
the laws
Says
play the insolence of
was
office and the
ambitious and
spurn,
short,
the
yet
patient
sure.
of the unworthy.
and takes.
I speak not to
When
disprove.
he
I hate to here I am, hate to say what I
With
do
the
know.
bills.
You all did love him once, not without cause.
These libels
What
and
cause
dreams.
withholds you then to
Set
mourn my
for
brother
king.
Clarence and the king,
Who would far
and did
more
hate the one against judgment? And
And
if thou art
be a
fled
traitor
to
to
brutish beasts, and men have lost his station,
Clarence.
bear with me. Closely mewed up about a
But that
prophecy
my
heart
heart
is
is
in the
something
coffin
after.
there with
It
Caesar,
says
I
that
must
G
pause.
of Edward's
So it
lips
come
come
back
back
to me. The undiscovered country.
Dive thoughts down.
So I'll hear
From
from
his border
Clarence
traveler
comes. Puzzles the will. And makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to those others we know not of. Thus conscience has made cowards of us all. And thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er, the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pitch and resolution, with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action. To be
Friends.
now, Roman countrymen, lend me your ears. Glorious summer, I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him.
Is the question.
And all the clouds that lowered upon our house in the deep bosom of the
But
ocean.
it is no
The evil men do
in the
lives
mind.
after them. The
Our
good is
hour
often
round
interred
bound
with their
to
bones.
victorious
Let it be.
arrows of outrageous
Our
fortune.
bruised
No
arms,
Brutus
Hans hath told you Caesar was
or
ambitious.
or
If
to
it
take
were
arms
so,
against
Western alarms, what is
each
we
of his
fear?
faults by opposing
A dreadful
and
march
grievously
to hath Caesar answered it. Grim-visaged war has here under leave.
spangled front.
Brutus and the
And
rest
now
of
instead of
innocent
mounting
Robert's
honorable
teeth to
men,
fright
are
so
they
all
still
adversaries he
honorable
honorable
men no more?
nimbly in come I to speak in Caesar's funeral.
Why
To the
does
lascivious pleasing
see
of
me
the end, the heartache, but on 1,000 natural shots
did
that
not flesh
shape
was
my friend, the consummation
faithful,
felt ready to be and just,
nor made to court
me.
amorous looking.
But Brutus says he was ambitious,
I,
and Brutus is an
that am
honorable
rude
man,
and
stout, and want
Love
an
to
majesty
see
perchance
struck
to
before
dream.
wanting
And he hath brought many captives, for in that sleep
of
his ransom did curtail his this veil, for then cheated Caesar of feature by dissembling nature, that the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept, that makes calamity unfinished and sent yet before my time into this breathing world. Is an honorable man. Scorns of that so lately and unfashionable proud man he said on the Lupercal. I hangs presented him a kingly crown, which he did thrice insolence abuse, when the spurn ambition yet of the unworthy says he was ambitious and sure himself might his made, but with a bare bodkin. I speak not just by my shadow in the sun. I am to say what I do know. You all did love him once, spared, not without sweat. What cause withholds you then mourn for him? To entertain these but that was said of something judgment. Determined. Thou art fled to brutish beasts, and men have lost their reason. Bear with me. Traveler returns. My heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause. Puzzles the will till it come back to me. It makes us rather bear those ills. friends, Romans, countrymen!
And lose the name of action. To be or not to be. To be is the question. That is the question. That is the question. Whether 'tis nobler, whether 'tis mind, whether 'tis no mind to suffer, slings and arrows, and outrageous fortune, or to take arms. Against to take a sea of troubles, take by opposing against a sea of troubles, and by opposing them, and to die, to sleep, no more, to sleep, no more, and by a sleep to say we end, by a sleep heartache, to say thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. The consummation devoutly to be wished. To die.
I come to bury Caesar.
To sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. We're in that sleep of death. By my shadow in the sun. Come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. Let's give us pause. Let's give us pause. And ammunition. Let's give us pause. And ammunition. And ammunition. And ammunition. Let's give us pause. And ammunition. 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 Or
Okay, folks, we are back. That brings us to the conclusion of part 1. Once again, I'm Megan Bridge, co-director of Fidget, and we're about to head into a 10-minute intermission and leg stretching break. But first, I'd like to briefly introduce Sarah and Maya so that you can see the people behind the duo pronounced 2 and behind those 10 powerful works we just saw. So here they come. They should be sharing their video any moment. And welcome, there they are. Welcome to both of you, Sarah and Maya. We'll have a chance to talk more at the Q&A, but for now, would you guys just mind saying hello, introducing yourself, and letting the audience know where you're zooming in from this evening?
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to see so many people are interested in this sort of paranormal mode of art. I am zooming in from the Boston area. Do you mind?
Hi everyone, I'm Maya. I'm zooming in from Salt Lake City. It's really wonderful to have your support. Thanks for being here tonight.
Great, thank you both so much for your powerful work. We are, in case you missed this in the beginning, there is a digital program and the link is being shared in the chat right now in case you'd like to peruse that during intermission. And then after the intermission, the next work that we're going to see is called Romanian Folk Dances 1, 2, and 3. And let's get excited. This is going to be a world premiere. Our intermission screen has a handy little countdown timer on it, so you'll be able to keep track of when you need to get back into your seat. And when the timer runs out, we're just going to go immediately into this 8-minute premiere, and then we'll come back for a 30-minute talk back with the artists. So stick around. All right, everybody, go stretch your legs, and we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us here. And thank you, Maya and Sarah, for that powerful premiere work. So excited to get a chance to talk to you guys a bit about all of the stuff that you've shared with us this evening. So welcome back again to our audience members for part 3, our artist chat. Just take a moment to introduce myself once more and the artists in case you joined late or you weren't paying attention in the beginning. My name is Megan Bridge. I am the co-director of Fidget, an experimental arts organization in Philadelphia, and I am zooming in from Philly tonight. Joining me are Maya Miro Johnson and Sarah Bushara, the 2 artists who together make up Pronounced 2. So come on in, Maya and Sarah, and go ahead and share your video and we will get chatting. To both of you, thank you for your thoughtful and incisive work. And to all of our audience members, the way this is going to work is we do have a dedicated Q&A box for your questions for the artists. Some of you have already noticed it and have made use of it. Feel free to use the chat, which is separate from the Q&A. We think that it'll be just more organized if you use the chat to comment and share your thoughts and offer praise for the performance. But if you have an actual question, go ahead and drop that into the Q&A because it helps us keep things a bit more organized on our end. So we'll get to that Q&A box in a second as it starts to populate with more audience questions. But first, if you don't mind, I would like to start off with a question of my own. And either or maybe perhaps both of you would like to speak a little bit to this. Just curious to hear you guys talk about your classical music background. Maya, I know that you're a trained violinist, a conductor, and a composer. And Sarah, I know that you play oboe as well as probably some other things as well. So I'm just curious how that, I know that Curtis is a pretty classical institution, and I'm really curious to hear you talk about how your classical training and pursuits butt up against your more conceptual and process-based background that we've been able to witness tonight.
Yeah, I suppose I can start. It's actually interesting. I've gotten into classical music fairly recently, despite being kind of embedded at this very classical institution. And I think maybe that informs my approach towards it as just another tool in the arena of artistry that a particular creator can delineate or choose from in a particular manner. I think it's strong to have, well, it's good to have strong technical training. I don't think you need to necessarily consider it classical. I think classical has a very kind of Eurocentric focus to it in terms of the way the word has been at least canonized or used in common parlance. So I kind of reject that aspect of saying that I have classical training, but I will say that I spend time, and I have spent time, and I've been fortunate enough to have spent time studying technical elements and trying to cross-relate them to each other. I wonder, Sarah has a little bit of a different background than me, so she might have a different perspective on this.
Sure. I mean, I'm a little bit older. I've already graduated from Curtis, but I was, like Maya, I was a little bit of a late bloomer too in classical music. I had a lot of interest, and I had a very standard American upbringing, and it kind of balanced academics and music pretty evenly. So so it wasn't like I was predestined for classical music or anything. But we did both end up at a very traditionalist institution, for better or for worse. I think that technical training in any medium is kind of requisite for experimentation. I think knowledge of being able to enact good sort of musical rhetoric and syntax is conducive to good rhetoric and syntax in other mediums. So whether we had been trained as filmmakers or writers or anything, I think any technical training kind of gives us the tools to create architectures that that make sense to us and gives us a means of actually enacting our ideas, which in our type of art is not natural. It starts with I don't know, you have some spark, and then it has to germinate somehow in the real world, and it has to germinate in an intelligible medium. So yeah, I think classical music training has kind of just given us the rhetoric and syntax to be able to enact these things.
That makes sense. And thank you for the clarification, Sarah, that you're no longer a student at Curtis. I missed that detail, so I appreciate your correction. Great, interesting to hear you guys talk about that juxtaposition of trainings. All right, we're going to go to a different end of the spectrum here, and we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Is eating a whole jar of salsa in 2 days skinny, fat, or slow? Be honest.
Okay, that one's for you, Sarah.
I'll take it. I think it's skinny. Salsa's pretty healthy. It's just, you know, vegetables, some seasoning, vinegar. I think it's very skinny. Eat the salsa.
Excellent, thank you. Next question. What is your favorite Bach chorale, Blue Book or otherwise?
I like the minor ones that stay minor at the end. I don't know, Picardy thirds are annoying. They bother me. Like, I'm like, just stick with it, you know, like commit. So.
Sarah, do you have one?
It's hard to pick. I prefer his orchestral works. I like all of his oratorios and cantatas, maybe not the chorales per se. But there's always the chorale from St. Matthew Passion, although that's a tried answer. I think if I had to pick a favorite, it would be that.
I mean, what's not to love about Bach in general? So it's a hard question to answer. All right, we've got a question from Thomas Pattison in the chat. He says, if I'm not mistaken, the original plan for Pronounced 2 was to perform your pieces on stage. How has your vision of the project changed amidst the pandemic and the forced migration to a digital platform? He says, it strikes me that many of the works we saw tonight could be realized only with great creativity, or perhaps not at all, on a stage as opposed to a screen.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And this kind of early juvenilia work of ours that we've demonstrated tonight is very much determined by the circumstances under which we find ourselves making it. I think we would have done something very different if we had been able to stay together in person and create works for the stage, which I think was originally the intent. And I think it can still be the intent, but I honestly think this kind of medium, like a paradigm shift to video and video art, or asynchronous art, such as the Zoom pieces that we presented, which have, I think, very, very minimal editing at all. I think that's honestly made it a little healthier for us. I think we've gotten a good dose of multiple types of art that we might have been more reticent to present on the stage. And yeah, I'm not going to say that there are benefits to the situation. It's a very difficult situation for lots of people, and I definitely don't want to disregard the trauma and the death that we've all experienced. I think at this point, 1 in 3 people have lost someone they know to the virus, so I don't want to minimize that at all, but I will say that it has forced us to think very differently, and that's not entirely a bad thing. And I hope that when we are able to create performance work for the stage again, that we kind of utilize this background we've established for ourselves with kind of spliced media and kind of experimenting with different aspects of media combining and different conglomerates. I hope that kind of continues to influence our work. And Sarah, what do you think?
I totally agree. I think you know, artists always have to deal with constraint, whether it's a commission for a stage, whether we have a specific concept we need to enact, whether there's a time constraint, an instrumental constraint. So it's, as Maya said, I would never want to suggest that that we were somehow benefited by this environment, because obviously there's no benefit can outweigh the damage that's been done. But yeah, some of the pieces that we've written were originally conceived for the stage, and we've had to kind of translate them into a digital medium, and others were conceived of totally for the purposes of online performance. So I think, yeah, we were exposed to things and sort of prompted to create things that maybe we wouldn't have before. So there's good and bad, but yeah.
And to add a little bit to that as well, the premiere that we presented, Romanian folk dances, that was actually one of the first pieces we did last year, and it ended up basically being right before in-person activities were canceled and everyone was kind of kicked out and sent home. And it was really fascinating coming back to it a year later and adapting it basically for this other environment, and wondering if perhaps the space and the time in between the different iterations of the piece allowed us to kind of trim the fat a little bit and focus on what the piece was really about, and maybe focus because we had the eye of the camera instead of the empty concert hall where it's more difficult to focus people's attention specifically. So that was one thing I thought of while Sarah was talking, that yeah, it was very interesting to adapt this piece that had been originally conceived totally differently and then move it into a totally different medium and discover kind of more intricacies maybe from that transition.
I really appreciate your use of the word constraint there too, Sarah. I think a lot about enabling constraints in my own practice. And I think that absolutely, you know, we can't really talk about the benefits of what our current situation is, but you know, some of these works translate so well to a digital platform. And of course, all the close mic'd ASMR stuff, is that the right initials? Yeah. And the richness of the sound. I'll say that you know, last fall in our Fidget programming committee meetings, we were thinking about, you know, trying to, we had done a couple of digital events that were performances, and trying to kind of translate dance or music to the screen was difficult, and we were like really looking for something that we could present that was created consciously for the medium. And this was such a pleasure to see your work come to light in this particular condition. So thank you again. Just a follow-up question from Thomas, which is still related to this topic. He says, how do you view the relationship between video-based social media, YouTube, TikTok, etc., and the Fluxus performance art tradition? And yeah, maybe this also can lead us a little bit into talking a little bit more about Fluxus, because I don't know if everybody logged on at this point still knows the history there of that movement. So maybe one of you could start off with just saying a little bit about Fluxus, and then lead us a little bit into thinking about if you're thinking about any relationships between that movement and our current kind of, perhaps we could call it the democratization of shared media art in a sort of a way, if you think of it that way. I don't know.
Sure, I think just quickly, maybe what drew us to Fluxus initially, in a very, to describe it very kind of reductionistically, was that it's an art that doesn't rest on the virtuosity of the performer. It's an art that anybody can perform, and that perhaps a performer who doesn't, you know, fashion themselves a performer, normally maybe they would even have a better or more true rendition. And I think what drew us to the movement was not even just these sort of philosophical or more general artistic connotations, but it was just mainly that it's a movement that was kind of underexpanded. I think it kind of began, and then there was never a true rupture. It's extremely new, very avant-garde and experimental, but it never really caught on. And not that it's unknown to people. I think the movement is known to maybe people in certain circles, but I think what drew us, well, first, when we started to create these pieces, this was to be honest, before I even knew Fluxus existed. So we were kind of wanting to put things on a stage that normally weren't, and then we sort of found a movement that did that to even more of an extreme degree. I think the fact that the democratization of performance and of sort of being on a stage and being seen has manifested in a way that maybe nobody could have expected with social media. Thomas mentions TikTok and YouTube, and I don't know where that situates us. I wonder if the limb of Fluxus that really exhibits its essence is on those platforms and not not on a concert stage. So I don't know. It's a question that we have to grapple with. But
It's interesting when you said that it hadn't really necessarily been proliferated as expected of a particular influential movement. I thought for a second that maybe it would be antithetical to Fluxus to become mainstream, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. I do think at least what draws me to Fluxus, other than just aesthetic values, are the ideas in it that have a kind of an emphasis on kind of intellectualizing the proletariat without being without being bourgeois, I guess. Or the idea is to avoid a patronizing arm when going into the idea of educating, because that can easily turn into proselytizing, which has a very like imperial miasma around it. So I liked certain aspects of the Fluxus movement that emphasized, rather than the ordinariness of art, it emphasized the beauty of ordinariness, and it really awakens your senses in a way that maybe like a parallel in a less multimedia world, in a more like music or classical music world, would be like Pauline Oliveros and like deep listening and those ideas. And I think I do think that you can like Oliveros and Xenakis at the same time. I do think you can like these two different people who, one had a very I think they're very similar approaches, actually, even though on the surface they seem quite different, where Oliveros is into the idea of sound existing and itself being art, and then Xenakis is more in the like hyper structured aspect where all sound is music, but it has to be organized by the composer in this like extremely rhetorical way. And I think you can have those both at the same time, and I think they exist in the Fluxus movement. And when we were performing or deciding how to perform Zen vaudeville, I think that really came to light with this duality between pieces that are impossible and pieces that are so ridiculously easy that anyone could do them, like make a salad, and that duality, I think, is really an exciting one that still has a lot of something to be explored in it still today.
Absolutely, thank you. So someone in the chat is asking, Shira Samuel Strag in the Q&A is asking what your conversations were like. I think as you developed the evening and was the decision to form Pronounced to a pre-pandemic one, I think you kind of answered that before. Do I understand correctly that you had started talking about forming your duo and then the pandemic hit, and so you were sort of forced into the digital medium? Yeah, and so then I'm just curious, as you continue to develop this work, are you already starting to envision works for the stage now? And this relates to a question that Catherine had that she put in the chat. She's just curious if there's a preferred or ideal way that a viewer would experience the work if we weren't isolated from each other, if there was a possibility for live audience. She asks, would they be sitting in a theater, laying in bed, dancing while watching your work? What are your thoughts on the audiences encountering your work in some future time?
I just talked a lot, so Sarah, why don't you go first?
Sure. Maybe this will be too short, but I think there's no ideal. I think for us, art is about enjoyment. I think as artists, if I may opine, I think that we're public servants. We're the servants of the audience, and that doesn't mean that we should be constantly at the will of what we think might be popular and what might not be. But I'm all for clapping in between movements or leaving before the second half. I mean, I think as much as I think some pieces maybe require a stage, I think if we're going to do something that's incredibly quotidian, like make a salad, maybe it's not a performance unless it's like really publicly Christianed a performance. So, but for other pieces, and even if we were to perform in concert halls, I mean, we only had one performance. It wasn't evening length, but we had one performance only before the pandemic, and it was an experimental electronic work, and people were confused and they were talking during the performance, and some people walked out angrily, and that's fine. In fact, that's good. I think the point of art is entertainment and enjoyment, and maybe sometimes the point isn't to be happy. Maybe sometimes the point is to be disturbed and to think and to reconsider values. But yes, but in short, I think there's no right way to experience it.
I agree mostly. I definitely agree that I would rather provoke a negative response than not provoke a response at all. I think the worst possible feedback is that someone didn't remember something, and there are different reasons for remembering something, but I think the point is always to be remembered. So I think with specific works, yes, they do need a stage or some stage-like environment, a video format where someone is really watching from beginning to end and not just scrolling or something like that. And maybe because they're so quotidian, as Sarah said, that without that stage environment, you don't notice the artistry. And the stage environment is something that totally focuses the senses in on things that would be unnoticed otherwise. That's why, like, I don't know, French New Wave film or like Andy Warhol's 7-hour films or something like that. Like, the reason they are cinematic in any way, shape, and form is that they are in the cinema, and that's the reason that looking up at the Empire State Building for 7 hours is art, is because it's in this environment in which you're thinking of it as art, and you notice new patterns and you discover new things and you have new thoughts because you're in the mindset of art. So I think that's the only like prerequisite necessarily, and that doesn't necessarily either determine space or location, as long as that focus and that mindset is present.
And arguably that mindset is hard to create when we're scrolling through a TikTok feed, I guess. So maybe in answer to Thomas's question, that's the biggest difference, right? Is actually the frame. Okay, I think we just have time for one more question. And there's one more unanswered question in the chat, in the Q&A here from Shira again. What do the scores for these pieces look like? I know that we saw some of the scores of the Fluxus pieces embedded within one of the works, but do you guys have scores for your own pieces, and what do those look like, and how complicated are they? And do you ever use spreadsheets for your scores? Go ahead.
As the resident composition major, I should respond to that first. It's a good question, because some pieces there are very like clear scores. I think those are typically more the pieces that are designed for live performance. In general, I would say everything is text-based. Perhaps with a few visuals, and then with the media pieces we made, like Catechism or Atonality or Manifesto or something like that. I don't remember creating I think it was a very collaborative process where we would discuss kind of the essence of the piece, the ideas in the piece, and then kind of fan out and find the images, and then come back together again and discuss order and structure and form in like actually very formalized terms, like ternary form or sonata form or rondo form or something like that. And at that point, there might be other tasks that we would assign to each other and come back. And I've been teaching myself a lot of like video editing software in the last year that I was lucky enough to get through a grant. So I would kind of be responsible for a lot of the collation and like the creation of the material. And then Sarah would be like this, Uber editor, basically, who could take, a 33,000 foot view and kind of zoom out and be able to see things I couldn't when I was like, cutting and pasting and doing things like that. So I think that was generally the process for a lot of the media pieces. And I think this is the last thing I'll say, but I think additionally, I like that our different performance personalities really come out, even within the same work, doing the same actions. And I really like the kind of, I don't know, musical variety within a piece, when Sarah appears doing an action versus I appear doing an action. And I think that's something we keep in mind when we're collaborating, is kind of the balance between the different personalities we can kind of draw from, and making sure that it's not too heavy on one or the other. And I think we balance each other out in that way quite a bit.
Anything to add to that, Sarah?
No, I think that was comprehensive. I think it's, for our pieces, I don't know, the scores, some of our pieces, one could consider what we've created as the piece, and maybe the score that we give ourselves is irrelevant. And then sometimes we like to consider the score to be the piece, and whatever we've created is just an iteration, just like, I don't know, somebody's iteration of a Bach partita or something. So you've seen actually some of, in the last piece on the first half, if anyone remembers, where along with the titles of each of the movements of the two partitas, we've included actually the scores that we gave each other as prompts to perform the piece. So sometimes the instructions are very rote, rinse a cup or do something, enact something, and the concept is not revealed to the performer at all, and it's kind of up to the audience to decide what the meaning is. And sometimes it's something poetic and almost inscrutable, like hard to say, and then you have to figure out what does that mean in the body, or what does it mean on the violin, or whatever. So yeah, the scores are fairly diverse, and whether the pieces that we've presented, whether those are the pieces or whether the pieces are the scores and we're merely interpreting them, is kind of, I don't know, that maybe that shouldn't be decided. So.
That reminded me that two of the pieces on the first half are actually from a larger work we're undergoing with an organization called Zeitgeist in the UK, and Toby Thatcher, who is a conductor and also the I guess the managing director of this organization. And that piece is, there's a score of about 10 text pieces, and we're disseminating those scores to different people who will interpret them in different ways. And so you saw, I think, number 1 and number 2. And the titles are already, I guess, as in the tradition of Fluxus pieces, are already kind of enough to create a lot of disturbance or maybe anxiety about how to perform the piece. And then what you didn't see for those two pieces that we shared, or the quote unquote instructions or the score of the piece, which was, I believe, Play God for Sisyphus and Refuse a Crown 3 times. Yes, and so those two pieces are just basically our way of interpreting those separately, and someone else can come along and look at the piece, which is in that case the score and not the video, and do something completely different, and it would still be basically one interpretation of that piece. So not necessarily unlike two different conductors' interpretations of Beethoven 7th, but it is different in that the result of those interpretations would be radically different on the surface.
Fascinating. It's so exciting to hear you talk about all of this stuff. A number of years ago, Fidget, for the John Cage centennial, we did a bunch of songbooks performances, and in a similar way, the John Cage songbooks have these sort of enigmatic scores that people can interpret, and the interpretations are wildly different from each other. So I love to sort of follow that lineage of Cage through Fluxus to now your work today. This has just been such an interesting and rich evening with you guys. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your work. I'm really glad, Maya, that you brought up your upcoming residency and performance with Zeitgeist. Maybe, Catherine, we can drop the Pronounce 2 website into the chat again so that people can follow Pronounce 2's work beyond this performance this evening. And then also for all of our audience members, again, thank you. Your donations to Fidget are sustaining, and we're gonna share the link in the chat again now, where you can donate directly to this event, and all of the proceeds go directly to the artists and the staff who came together to make this possible this evening. So once again, I thank you, Pronounce 2, Sarah and Maya. Thank you so much for being here with us, and have a wonderful night. Oh, everyone, before I dismiss everybody, is there anything else that you guys want to share that I forgot or that we didn't get to that you want our audiences to know? All right, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you all so much. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Good night.